Okay, thanks everybody for being here. I think we're going to get quite a few more presenters or quite a few more participants. I just sent out a reminder email. Each presenter has 25 minutes to present and 5 minutes for questions. If you go a little short, that's fine. Just going long is not good. Just so we keep everybody on time. I will post the link to the peer review evaluation form into the chat. I also sent that via email with instructions on who needs to evaluate who. So you could take a look at that. We just do ask presenters to read the questions out loud before answering them so that the questions are captured in the recording. And I think that's it. So John Seegers, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and start. Don't forget to unmute.
All righty, can you see the screen all right?
Yep, and we can hear you.
Yeah, normally it has a halo around it, but I don't see that at this time. So at any rate, if everything's good, I'll get started. Good morning, my name is John Seegers, and this is my capstone project presentation, ArcGIS as a tool for infrastructure documentation and asset management, establishing a GIS for computer network documentation. As this presentation transitions from slide to slide, I'll typically have a background image. These images come directly from a populated working version of this management framework that will serve to highlight and illustrate some of the features and benefits of adopting such a system. This screen that we're looking at here shows exactly how ArcGIS may be used to record infrastructure details and documentation. From this JavaScript web application, we selected a point feature class called the Vault. Looking to the left, we can see that it is an existing telecommunications vault containing fiber optic cabling. On the right is a more descriptive AutoCAD rendition of the same vault. In the middle are a few of the attributes pulled from an attribute table, which includes items such as the vault name, last updated date, notes, as well as various attachments in the form of photographs, which we've just discussed. Managing any multi-building production network is a challenge. Managing and maintaining a geographically dispersed network is even more of a challenge because of the combinations of numerous WAN connections in conjunction with a myriad of internal LAN and building interconnections. This task becomes fraught with problems from the start. Common issues are switch and equipment firmware revisions and compatibility among them, as well as basic asset location within their respective racks. Add to this amalgamation new users, administrators, and confusion is certain. Having a basic framework from which to begin eases the burden and may help shorten the process of filling in the blanks concerning equipment and asset locations, may allow organization to focus on creating and capturing the data and information it requires in order to better manage its infrastructure and inventory. In this image, we're looking at a rack. Racks hold equipment. Both are point feature classes within the management framework. In this case, a rack contains several pieces of equipment in the form of switches and firewalls. Racks have slots or numbers to spatially identify equipment locations within them. A switch may be a 1U size or one rack unit size. It could be located in a position, say 33 of 46 U's available within the rack. These switches provide basic network interconnections and data sharing capabilities, while the firewalls dictate where traffic may flow from and to within the network. The project slides we'll be looking at include the project itself, a history and how the project came into being, an initial project plan, and some unfortunate scope creep we encountered, the software used to develop the framework, all-important data dictionary, a basic system design, implementation timeline, and team organization. The final framework, some lessons learned, some literature and citations are used, as well as conference choices. This image is a series of 3 racks, in which the 2 on the left provide cable management and patch panel functionality, while the one on the right holds equipment in the form of a fiber optic shelf, chassis switch, cable management gear, and telecom gear. The project is a case study for the University of North Georgia, which maintains 5 geographically dispersed campuses serving some 20,000 students. Goals of the project include documentation of all the network resources in order to ensure availability, record inventory and location, help document uptime, and more importantly, to allow for future growth and to facilitate planning. Oftentimes, small colleges and universities, as well as some governmental agencies, lack the resources necessary to adequately document their critical network infrastructure. Through partnerships with organizations such as ESRI, these organizations may be able to gain access to free or no-cost software and be better able to document their networks. Next, we'll look at where we're at, where we're going, and how we'll make this transition. When the project began, there was no system in place. Network documentation was non-existent. If it did exist, it was in the form of a PDF or architectural drawings, typically stored in each of the various departments' offices. We're going to move to a defined digital archive through the use of this framework, which was created using ArcGIS and PostgreSQL. We designed a database, established feature classes and relationships, and created basic workflows to allow users to update and modify the assets and infrastructure. The capture and create process is where we'll make a transition and begin actually creating some of the digitization and operational layers which will populate the framework. This is oftentimes the most time-consuming process. In this example, we're looking at silver vertical pipes, which are polylines within the framework called conduits. These conduits encapsulate either copper or fiber cable, both linear features in the framework, and both transmit low voltage power and data across the network. Project conception and growth. The initial model was going to be a simple solution to help locate and document network closets. We'd provide spatial information in the form of maps to workers and employees and perhaps student workers, and they would use a JavaScript interface to record audit data for each of the various closets. As we began the implementation of this database, we found that we were experiencing scope creep in the form of capturing way too many features. Features such as fiber splice points, historical floor plans, cable drops in each room, wireless locations, and much more. So we decided to rein things back in, limiting the features and relationships we create, and focus on network closets, fiber mapping, vaults, and critical infrastructure, so that we can better track the inventory items in place, have a better handle on surplus equipment in this location, and be able to generate reports as to what each data closet has within it. In this example, we're looking at one of our server rooms. This is from the ArcGIS desktop interface. These server rooms house densely populated racks, typically have crack units or computer room air conditioning, and almost always have independent generator backups for use during extended power outages. And this is a picture of the actual server room depicted in the ArcGIS desktop interface. ArcGIS is used to create the operational layers such as the building footprints, floor plans, conduit routings, rack locations, etc. Once this is digitized, it may be presented as shown as an overlay on top of georeferenced architectural drawings or other operational layers. This type of information facilitates planning because accurate georeferencing using an appropriate projection allows calculation of distances, so project and cabling estimates may be generated without requiring site visits. And on the right, you see a database expanded to show the framework in place. PostgreSQL was selected as the backend database primarily because of its working quite well with ArcGIS, and the fact that it's free and open source is a definite plus. The example on the right is a simple query using the PostgreSQL GUI to pull up switch information. Obtaining data and reports from ArcGIS directly is a bit limited because it typically only allows for a single table or join tables to be queried. Accessing data from the database backend, such as this, circumvents the limitation and allows for much more robust query capabilities. This is a PostgreSQL ERD, or Entity Relationship Diagram. This is useful in that it shows various feature classes and tables, their fields, as well as data types. We expand upon this by using a data dictionary, which actually describes the various fields, what they store, the data types, and it goes on to explain any relationships and attachments. It details any naming conventions in use and provides the user with basic information to create and update other metadata. And on the right is an example of my data dictionary where we're looking at the rack feature class. This is a typical model which is in place at UNG. Access is limited to certain IP address ranges, and remote access is available to users and management through a VPN connection. Implementation of the framework is through a phased approach, such as follows. Stand up the ArcGIS server, PostgreSQL server, begin the creation and digitization of the infrastructure assets, define and generate the reports needed, publish the REST services, and continue to work on the JavaScript API, and then present a basic workflow to the users. The example here is a typical example that we use. We have a power user and a couple of assistants who do the digitization and data collection. And we work with our enterprise systems to have the database and the GIS server, ArcGIS server, stood up and running. In this final model, we'll be looking at the ArcGIS desktop session showing our student health data closet in red hash. We've drilled down into the A rack to display the equipment it houses in the form of a photograph on the left. This is a typical Aruba chassis switch. We've also expanded the maintenance history on the right to show the recent tasks which have been performed, such as replacing a faulty power supply, updating firmware, and so forth. For individual pieces of equipment such as this, their attachments may be saved as well, such as a copy of the configuration file, manual, proper running firmware, etc. The final model is a fully functional framework, which may be an aid to other organizations in developing their own asset management system through a GIS. Key benefits include centralized data storage, reporting functionality, aids in planning and visualization of infrastructure, and this is easily scalable to incorporate 3D modeling and more. And this example is a JavaScript interface that a worker might use to locate a data closet. This is an example on a tablet type device where we're basically looking at just the fiber cable and the vaults across a single campus. Some of the lessons learned, which could be of particular interest if one adopts this framework, selected JavaScript originally. However, in hindsight, using ArcGIS online may be a better solution, especially if one wants to ramp up production rapidly. Proper database design is critical, and designing for the future is essential. Making backups is critical as well, and the more the better. Most importantly, update the data dictionary and keep it in sync with current developments. In this image, we're looking at hyperlinks. These are hooks to a secure shell session for direct console connection to any of the network devices within the framework. Future enhancements, I'd like to incorporate PySNMP in order to poll devices, automate and perform updates, as well as get real-time device status. Eventually, I'd like to incorporate support to include network topology so that we can generate fiber tracing functionality from head-end to termination point. Some of the literature and citations used throughout this presentation are as follows. And the conference I plan on presenting at actually just occurred this week. The Georgia Geospatial Association, formerly Georgia ERISA, had a conference just this week, actually. And thank you.
Thanks, John. Do we have any questions? Great job. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I was just curious how this compares to what Penn State does, since I know your advisor works in the physical plant and probably has some similar things. So did the two of you compare notes?
Is this for me or?
Yeah, that's for you, John.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we absolutely did. And I'd learned a lot of good info from John. And I'm actually transitioning in my current position into facilities where we'll be doing much similar tasks. So his insights, and especially the use of ArcGIS Online, were very helpful.
Great. You have a question from JB in the chat.
From Dr. Sharma. Can ArcGIS ingest building information models, BIMs, that architects use? I'm not personally familiar with that, but I know that they do have a lot of, have advanced a great deal, and they do have a building infrastructure management section in use. So that's something I would definitely look into. And it would certainly come in handy if they do.
Any other questions? You can, John, if you are willing to put your email address in the chat, just in case anybody has any follow-up questions.
I'll give a Gmail address. That'll be, let me give my PSU.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on, Jonathan Wheeler is next, another John. So Jonathan, whenever you're ready, you can start sharing and go ahead and start.
Good morning, my name's Jonathan Wheeler. I'm here today to present my planned capstone project that will help expose work completed in the late 1800s.
And we don't see it yet, Jonathan, did you share it?
Okay, 1 second. Yeah, I saw that.
There we go. Yes, now we can see it.
Okay. So with using modern technology and more specific geographic information systems, this came about because I was approached with a project idea that was both useful and needed in my current position as a GIS specialist. The problem identified is that individuals and groups would like to view original surveyed land more easily than they already do. And they asked what tools or ideas could you put together to make this happen? And then why is this needed? Well, in general, there is a large system used nationally for anyone to view original surveys conducted by the government of the United States that have been previously collected from paper originals and made digital. In times past, a person seeking information from a paper map would go to the map room, pull it out, and look over it for items to further investigate. Then with technology, it has been digitized, archiving the paper copy and now referencing the digital copy. With digital records management increasing to every workspace and the ability to harness GIS and other tools, finding ways to increase ease of access has become more involved and sought after. So what else is possible and how will GIS help? With that, a solution idea was to create a group of the digital records to expand over larger areas, and all while behind a monitor screen to quickly and easily reference changes and, if possible, find new methods or applications to apply and make the experience more worthwhile. Think of an elevator pitch. I worked out a quick talk to give you an idea before I get further into the background and methodology of this project. So the pitch being, what I'm going to do for my capstone project is collect the digital versions of an original.
Jonathan, we're still seeing your first slide. So do you have
Yes.
2 monitors?
Yeah, it's supposed
Okay.
to be a slide.
Okay, okay.
So with that process of taking the original surveys in Idaho and using ArcGIS Pro, I'll georeference the public land survey system and then put them together for a study area that allows everyone to observe changes from a time of those surveys through the present. Additionally, there are ideas on creating a tool or tools that anyone can use or follow along with to allow the process to be replicated and used in other locations by other folks seeking the same concept for investigating digital surveys. So this is the original surveys to show historical change in our environment and society. With an introduction, the original surveys from the General Land Office records have been maintained by U.S. Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management. In Idaho, with the GLO precisely locating an initial point on a volcanic hill south of Kuna on April 19th, 1867, the original surveys were conducted in order to identify land to be further developed or examined for use considerations that include extensive both natural and built areas. For this study and using every software, we'll work to georeference the original surveys for ease of comparison with current maps, and GIS will be conducted. As part of an agency, public, or other group, these maps may be used to observe and learn from changes that have taken place over time, including modified landscapes and environment as our society has developed. An example is investigating sites that have potential interest for archaeological studies to display historical comparison. The starting history for public lands. It's important to understand that the history behind why original surveys are important and have relevancy during investigating and planning. In 1776, independence was declared, and by 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. But soon to follow, in 1785, there was a land ordinance passed. This land ordinance stated that anything west of the Appalachian Mountains was to be surveyed using cadastral survey plat systematic approach, also commonly known as the rectangular survey system or public land survey system, which was proposed by Thomas Jefferson. By 1800, tract book system was established by an act of Congress. This is designed to be a permanent reference for all land transactions for the survey of public lands. It's broken down by state, territory, meridian, township, range, section, and subdivision. After 108 years, and a new system called the serial register system was designed. This was created to fill a need to document the history of each land case transaction that occurred on the public lands. By 1955, another change occurred as Congress authorized the land status record system. This is the tract book system had become so difficult to read and cumbersome to use. The first step was to microfilm all patents, withdrawals, proclamations, orders, and other relevant related documents that affected land status. And this consists of 6 parts: a master title plat, a use plat, and supplemental plat, the historical index, control documents index, and index to miscellaneous documents and serial register pages. The BLM Manual 1275 describes each component of the land status record system in depth. With agency history for public lands in the United States, prior to 1812, the Secretary of the Treasury directly handled these public land sales. The Department of War administered military land warrants, and the State Department administered land patents. In 1812, Congress created the General Land Office. They were to handle the rapidly growing public land business and create the surveys that we will use today. By 1849, the Department of Interior was created, and the General Land Office, also known as the GLO, was transferred into the Department of Interior. And then by 1879, the U.S. Geological Survey was established and put into the Department of Interior. Congress consolidated independent efforts of surveying the West into this organization for the classification of public lands and examination of the geological structure, mineral resources, and products of the national domain. Because the GLO relied on USGS of geologic and hydrographic knowledge. Conservation of public land became a concern for many years, especially considering grazing and the mineral rights. By 1934, Congress created a division of grazing separately within the Department of Interior. But soon after, in 1946, on July 16th, the General Land Office and U.S. Grazing Service became what is now known as the Bureau of Land Management. And with this date, E. Louis Peffer said there opened a new chapter in the history of public land administration in the United States. Current records management for historical surveys is managed by the BLM Eastern States District, where they oversee the digital site and GLO records, allowing them to be available for anyone to view and use. These surveys have useful needs, but sometimes it's not readily thought about for how to use them. Possibilities with the historical surveys: archaeology and cultural resources. They can reference and review a known area of interest and then conduct surveys or investigations from original historical records. With abandoned mine lands, the BLM's Abandoned Mine Lands program enhances public safety and improves water, soil, and air quality by reducing or eliminating the efforts of past hard rock, such as gold, silver, lead, or uranium, mining in the Western states. The BLM maintains an inventory of known abandoned mine lands, which are mostly hard rock mines, on BLM managed lands. As of January 5th, 2017, inventory contained over 52,000 sites, of which only 20% have been remediated or do not require further action. That means there's a remaining 80% required further investigation and or remediation. With original surveys, you can also view boundary changes with the use of priority of calls, which priority of calls are natural objects such as your rivers, mountains, and ridges, artificial objects like monuments, surveyor marks, and man-made improvements, and then distances to linear measure using meets and bounds is next, followed by bearings of direction and acreage or quantity of land. Another useful method is education outreach. So presenting this work or work followed on with information to local schools to engage with students on what is around them and the history behind it all. This can influence desires into GIS or other studies that provide expanding learning possibilities. So where has this type of project been investigated? The Puget Sound River History Project studies the historical landscape of Puget Sound's lowland rivers and estuaries as a dynamically linked geophysical, ecological, and human system. The historical emphasis is on conditions at the time of the earliest Euro-American settlements in the mid-19th century, but also includes the landscape's post-glacial, Holocene, evolution, and the last century and a half of change. They undertake interdisciplinary research that integrates archival investigations, field studies, and the tools of geographic information systems and remote sensing. They also apply the results to and make data available for regional problems of resource management, restoration, and planning. As you can see in the map shown, this is a location in the Puget Sound. Each one of these dots is interactive, and when clicking on a location, you see it brings up an original survey in the box on the right. That original survey is the Eugene Ellicott. It's a scale of 1 to 20,000 and geo-referenced to the current system. How else can this be used, and what will make this useful? Well, historical maps have the potential to aid archaeological investigations into the persistence of Native American settlements during the mid-19th century, a time when many Native communities disappear from archaeological view. Focused on Tamales Bay in Central California, this project evaluated the usefulness of historical maps as a way to discover and interpret archaeological deposits dating to the period, with an aim of better understanding indigenous patterns of residents at the transition from missionary to settler colonialism. In particular, they focus on diseñeros and plats created to document Mexican-era land grants, as well as early maps produced by the General Land Office and United States Coast Survey. Although they note inconsistencies regarding the inclusion of indigenous settlements on historical maps, their case study offers an example of how archaeologists can employ historical maps and targeted archaeological ground truthing to discover sites that are poorly represented in the historical and archaeological records. Observing the study area alongside a historical map that shows settlements give an investigator starting points to follow up with. So with these, you can see on the right side with the historical map, there are settlements along the Tamales Bay. In those sites, then you can see the majority of them fall in the Rancho Punta area. And then this can be used to go and further investigate and find archaeological sites. So the goals for this project: to display environmental and societal changes using historical surveys and GIS. To allow users and stakeholders to quickly view these and other changes. The problem is solved taking original surveys conducted in the late 1800s and geo-reference them to the current public land survey system for Idaho and allow them to be viewed in a mosaic. This gives multiple users an advantage to identify changes or differences quickly and easily. And then another goal is to expand the methodology with tools and improve the user's experience. Objective for this project: the project is a capstone within the given study area, and with the research and work conducted, it will demonstrate how Esri software helps students learn, discover, and employ the capabilities available. A presentation may be taken to high schools to engage with students on education and career paths. This work additionally fits into government and land records, as surveys create land boundaries and mark them for the first time for records which tell stories, educate, and verify historical records. A basic workflow will be determining the study area, retrieving the GLO original surveys, converting those surveys to raster graphic images as TIFFs, create an ArcGIS Pro project, then add the data, adding a PLSS layer from the Living Atlas and original surveys as TIFFs, and then geoprocessing with georeferencing the TIFF, clipping the TIFF to the PLSS layer, and then observe change with the study area. This basic workflow will be the base for what expands to using other options within study areas or work needs. As you can see in this slide, it displays original surveys. The original surveys that shows both the study area and the individual township range original survey. The anticipated results is focused on using these collections with shown maps. So on the left, we see this was a survey of a 4x5 area to start off with the initial point. And then from the initial point, each township range in these sections was surveyed by an individual to note the times and the areas of the period. So this is the study area map. So this is with the original survey, geo-reference to the project study area in Idaho. The inset map in the bottom left shows the location in the southwest portion of Idaho. Initial point is located at 1 north, 1 east in the lower left corner. With that, the expansion for the surveys to start in 1867 went northeast towards the city of Boise. And this is the inset map located for viewing. And then with the inset map, it shows the location of the southwest portion of Idaho near Boise. The map scale is decreased, showing the individual surveys within a larger study area survey. The original surveys of 1 east, 1 north shows that at the time of the survey, it was noted that land rocky, unfit for settlement, and unsurveyed. So in the first survey conducted, this land was unfit and rocky, while this land was surveyed. And then in this survey, you can see this is the Indian River Plateau. And then within the study area, continue to reference the General Land Office surveys and then geo-reference them. So the additional workflow plans. So taking from the baseline of the work process, we're going to try to work on creating a task workflow through ArcGIS Pro. This will allow other users to open a project, download original surveys from the BLM GLO records, and perform the operation following the task items identified. Another tool is to create a Python script for large planned areas of interest. This operation will require a higher level of user capabilities to plan and produce in comparison to the task workflow that will be set up for an easier use for users. Tasks and scripts will allow others to adopt the current workflow and use it to build out other study areas and assist in improving on the current methods that best fits use cases independently. In this timeline, currently conducting the presentation, the next will create the workflow options from January through March, and then do the final elements in 596B, and then plan to present at the Esri User Conference in July. The problem solved taking original surveys conducted in the late 1800s, geo-reference them to the current public land survey system for Idaho and allows them to be viewed in a mosaic. This gives multiple users an advantage to identify changes or differences easily and quickly. Some aspects of this project are also to identify how else these surveys can be referenced in changing environment and society, reflecting on the original collection. The idea to get others involved in the changes brings a potential to share with schools, in particular, ideas to help students identify the changes using technology while understanding the historical aspects of the location around them as well. There are uses that have yet to be discovered and in this project, but with the initial setup and framework, it is a project to be shared for and any type of use case may fit into. All right, thank you. Any questions at this time?
Great job, Jonathan. Very interesting project. Does anybody have any questions? Well, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I was just curious what career paths you would suggest for students who are interested in this when they're shown all of this, because it's such a, it kind of crosses lots of different things.
Interesting. So one of the things is I've been approached with schools for different types of information on Initial Point, which is here in Kuna, Idaho. And within that, there are many different resources, but with GIS, we can also combine the use of surveys, the understanding of technology, and figure out if somebody is interested in pursuing a career in GIS, they know that they can have options with what is on the ground, and then also with the software and scripting and tools to use at their disposal. So there's many different things to look at, and then hopefully have students put some of these things together themselves and maybe find an interest in something specific.
Yeah, it would be nice to have a few more geography majors as freshmen.
Yeah.
Roberto has a question.
Yes, so that I see for georeference are using UTM. Yes, and so the public land survey system, obviously you can adjust the different reference systems, but what I'm using is for Idaho and specifically, and the changes can be through figuring out if you want to write a script or a process for a given area. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So if you want to put your email address in the chat, that'd be great. And if
Yep.
anybody has a follow-up, they can send you a question. And Roberto Lazaga is next. So Roberto, if you want to go ahead and share and start whenever you're ready.
Yes, ma'am. Give me one moment. Let's see here. Give me one moment. I'll stop sharing and try to load up first.
If you, I don't know. that
Just
you
give
have-
me
yeah. Okay.
one moment. I'm having a slight panic attack.
Okay, no, you're good. You're fine. We're ahead of schedule, so you're fine. If you, do you have it in a PowerPoint or is it just in a PDF?
I have it in PowerPoint.
Okay, so if you put it in slideshow mode, once you share it, then it should kind of fill the screen. We have plenty of time.
Okay, yes, ma'am. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that.
You're fine.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Roberto Lazaga. I work in transportation engineering at the city of Ocala. So ended up doing my project looking at how to enhance traffic control design, especially in areas of temporary traffic control. We narrowed it down to that. That is when people put out signs and and cones to direct traffic to basically manage a work zone. Dr. Patrick Dudas is my advisor, and he's been very helpful in narrowing down and helping develop the kind of research that I'm looking at doing and kind of creating a baseline. I'm kind of looking at a foundation for which I'm going to do future research. So a little bit about the background on traffic control. From the 1920s on, there's been a national standard that has developed, and the current name is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. This is a standard that all cities, all counties, all states must meet for their traffic control design. So dealing with signals, dealing with signage like stop signs, yield signs, what they look like, what can be on them, the colors. There is a lot of space that states and local governments can build upon. And so in the state of Florida, we have the Florida Department of Transportation standard plans for road construction. That also involves traffic control devices and temporary control devices and plans. So in the state of Florida, we have additional signs that are utilized in support of the MUTCD's signage. So traffic control devices are shown to improve road safety. Studies on them are reoccurring. States like state agencies like FDOT conducts studies, and they even pilot programs. Here in the city of Ocala, we piloted a program where we have a digital sign that's really bright. It actually gives me a headache when I see it. But it basically tells people of road conditions that are approaching and some of the things that they need to be aware of in advance. And it's a smaller sign, so it goes on your county roads or your state roads, versus something large on the interstate. So the FDOT standard plans are yearly updated, where the MUTCD is periodically updated. They're in the process of coming out with a new edition. It really depends on what the requirements are, in terms of laws, because these are legal documents. So in the state of Florida, the FDOT standard plans are required to be updated yearly. But the MUTCD has revisions as it needs, and there's a need present, especially as there's more traffic and there's changes in the population. It becomes more of a concern of how to deal with issues of congestion and how to better design, and looking at what designs can improve roadway safety. So temporary traffic controls are important in the fact that they tell the population, the public, of conditions that disrupt the normal pattern. So an example is if there's a utility strike and a public works team has to go out and fix it, they're going to have to set up, if it's close enough to the roadway, based on the standard plans in the state of Florida or the MUTCD, they have to set up codes and they have to set up signage in relation to that. If the utility strike occurred where there's damage in the roadway, you're looking at a lane closure. So standard plans are what's used to guide the temporary traffic control measures. It tells that people where they need to set up and how to set up the flow pattern of setting up your temporary traffic control. So the impact of my research is looking at the fact that in 2D spaces, that's typically where you find design. When I build temporary traffic control maps, I'm doing that inside, GIS in a 2D environment, or I'm doing it in AutoCAD in a 2D environment. But that does have limitations. Quite a bit of limitations that I've seen is I've built based on the minimum suggested distance. I've built a MOT map or a TTC map where I'm looking at a 200-foot difference, between spacing based on what they suggest. But there might be a turn that there's a blocked view of that sign, so you wouldn't ever see it. So when the guys are out in the field, they end up putting the sign a bit further downstream, closer to the work zone, so that oncoming traffic to the work zone will be able to better visualize the change in the pattern and make adjustments appropriately. So the idea is that this is going to improve the design of temporary traffic control plans. It's going to help people that are in that situation where they're designing it to better understand the conditions of the field and elements that you can't account for in a 2D map, unless you were to maybe do a viewshed analysis and kind of pull in a lot of different data sets. It can also help remote workers understanding conditions in the environment of which they're building. So if they're building for example, if you're building a work zone location and you're putting in the pipes, you're showing what's going to be done in there, and then you have to include in a TTC map, you could look at what that would look like in relation to your project. So I'm looking at utilizing VR as this 3D component that brings this dimension, because you have 2D and 3D GIS. I want to take it a step further and look at VR. I want to look at how virtual reality can improve that awareness of the ground, the situational awareness of the work zone in relation to the temporary traffic control pattern. And VR GIS has been used in a few different scenarios in my paper for this semester. There are a few sources that were important to guiding my thought process. And one is VR GIS used in urban development, where in Gaza, they had used the city engine with the ArcGIS VR 360 to visualize transportation changes and presented that to decision makers and look at a usability test of whether that was something that people would be interested in using in the future. And they found that decision makers were very much inclined to adopt that. Another example of VR usage in a similar area is worker behavior, unsafe behaviors, measuring that in work zones, where they looked at risk habitation, where a worker does the same thing over and over again, and then they end up becoming complacent with dangers around them, and that puts them at a higher risk. And then I looked at a questionnaire of how to develop a questionnaire in relation to what I'm going to do. Because the point of the project is to test the difference between the 2D and 3D environment, but to also get insight into how professionals that, set up, temporary traffic control measures, what their thoughts are on adopting this and utilizing this, going forward. So I have 4 phases that are involved with my project. This kind of goes along with the timeline where I'm going to be developing the VR environment, developing the 2D environment. I'll be testing in each environment and then, getting the results. So developing that, I'm going to be doing from December till about mid February. And then for the rest of February, I'm looking to do the data collection. For March, I'm looking to do analysis and leave an additional month if I need to for further analysis, or if we needed to change something in the previous schedule, leave that an extra month for that, and then look at sharing this at a conference. My advisor recommended I actually utilize maybe a conference in a similar fields like public works, looking at maybe a conference they have and presenting at a conference, something in that area. So I'm speaking to my supervisor on a number of things related to this. And that's something I've raised with him, and he's going to look into. I've reached out to our public works and our utilities department here at the city of Ocala, where I work. I've reached out to those directors who I work with and asked them about different conferences, and they said they'll get back to me. So the process, it's going to involve creating temporary traffic control design in 2D and 3D space. Participants will, half the participants will first design in 2D and then in 3D space, and then the opposite for the other half to remove learning bias. I'm looking at an area about 400 square feet where participants will come into the area. They'll take the survey. They'll have some information collected on what they do and how that relates to temporary traffic control and maybe their experience in related to 3D, two digital environments. So I'm looking to have questions that relate to VR, but maybe a little bit more broad, where it talks about questions that get information, how they even, do they play video games? Like, what is their experience in a 3D digital environment? So currently I'm looking at using 10 participants, professionals involved in either temporary traffic control design or its implementation out in the field. I'm looking at using workers that are here part of the local governments who have to, like at the city of Ocala, we require that anyone who's going to be involved with design or are going to be out in the field. So like our line workers, myself, our engineer techs have to have the temporary traffic control intermediate certification through the Florida Department of Transportation. So that's going to be one requirement I'm looking at, is that they have to have that at least to participate in this research. They'll come in, they'll sign a waiver, they'll have an introduction to the software and what's involved, and then they'll design in the 2D and 3D space. And then there'll be a exit survey that asks about their experience, what they thought, and maybe future implementation, usability, to evaluate the usability of VR GIS. I'm estimating that it's going to take about 2 weeks to complete. I'm looking at possibly 2 days a week, doing 3 to 4 people, but it will depend on work schedules and availabilities and the location that I would be able to get. So here's an example of a standard plan design. This is the one that will actually be used for this research. They'll be designing this plan, so to speak, but having different conditions. So there's spacing that's minimum suggested. Under normal conditions, it's required, but it's suggested. And so I'm looking at having a topographical area that would disrupt this area, which is the advanced warning area, so that the spacing of signage has to accommodate the difference in topography. So there are 4 zones with this. There's the advanced warning, there's this transition, you have your work area, and then you have your termination zone. This is the area I'm focusing on where they're gonna have to set up signs at an interval that's different from the minimum that's required. For the data sets, I'm looking to use LiDAR to create my terrain. I have access to the 2003 LiDAR that was collected here in the Marion County area. I'm going to use that if 3D elevation program data is not available. And then for data sets, I'm going to use road center lines and possibly looking to build, to bring in building footprints and water bodies. I'm going to be using the local county municipal data sets, and I'll be considering the age and quality that's available. I know some of the data that we have here was created in-house, while other data is brought in from like the USGS. So these are going to be considerations for the data that I do utilize to visualize the environment. But what I put in the 2D, I have to put in 3D. That's how I'm looking at it. It's in some way I need to involve that so that there's not a difference that should not affect the way that workers perceive the environment. So I'm looking at evaluating accuracy and precision between the predetermined points for where they should place the signs, the cones, and create the design. I'm going to evaluate the accuracy and precision between those. And I'm looking at using the questionnaire to understand the usability, conduct like a usability test on the software. These are the references I had, and if anyone has any questions, I'll put my email in. So if you guys want to follow up, or if you wanted to share some insights, some questions, areas that I'm looking for is ArcGIS Map SDK for Unity. That is what I'm going to be using to build the environment. So if anyone has any experience with that, I would appreciate any insights. Prior experience with VRGIS would be helpful if you can maybe share some experiences utilizing that. And a question of the number of participants, would 10 be appropriate? What are some thoughts? I'm looking at with the presentation of this research being like the foundation for future research, where I want to look at comparing 3D environment then to VRGIS, changing conditions so that in a VR you can add real world conditions. So adding fog, adding rain would affect the way a person's going to view or see see the road conditions, despite the fact that people do have to deal with that. It's a considerable problem. So I want to continue research from this. This is my base research. So if anyone can share any thoughts on these, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Great job, Roberto. Does anybody have any questions? Just while people are typing, I'm sure you and your advisor have talked about the Human Research Protections Program, that get an IRB for the survey you're going to do. So make sure you do that, I guess.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry, I did not mention that. Yeah, I contacted IRB because we are looking to use ARC survey.
Great.
So we contacted IRB, and then I'm going through the training courses on that. Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. I assumed so. I just thought I'd mention it. And type your questions in for Roberto. I also, while you were talking, I thought about, you said you were going to ask your supervisors about where to possibly present. And you're probably aware of these, but there's the International Conference on Urban Transportation Systems in March in Miami. And then there's an American Council of Engineering Companies of Florida's Transportation Conference in July in Orlando. So just thought that was potentially 2 places that would be interested in this for sure.
Yes, ma'am. My supervisor, he's the transportation engineer.
Nice,
That
yeah,
thought was going to look into those. He had said
perfect.
about that and shared some information because he talked about some upcoming conferences.
Yeah,
Named a few there, a few other conferences or events that I might be able to present at. So
great.
yes, ma'am, that's awesome. I'll take note of that.
Yeah, and for that March one, I don't know when the due date is. I was trying to figure that out. So you might just want to keep an eye on that to make sure you're not coming up on that in case that's the one that you guys pick.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other questions? Great job, though. This looks really interesting. Looking forward to seeing how it turns out.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any questions, so maybe people are still thinking about it. So if you want to put your email address in the chat there, then maybe some folks will send you questions through email. And so up next, we have Jonathan Mickelin. So Jonathan, whenever you want to go ahead and share, and you can start when you're ready.
All right, can can everyone see my screen good?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Mickelin, and I'm here to present my capstone proposal, a Geobia approach to locating and assessing HWA-affected eastern hemlock trees in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. My advisor for this project has been Dr. J.B. Sharma. So the following is an overview of what I plan to cover today, starting with a background review of the hemlock woolly adelgid, eastern hemlock trees, and my study area of Shenandoah National Park. This will be followed by an outline of this project's goals and objectives. A detailed description of my planned methodology will be examined, including the necessary project data, a general workflow description, and a review of a pilot project I conducted earlier this semester in Geography 883. Lastly, we'll look at the timeline I plan to follow and the anticipated results. So the hemlock woolly adelgid, commonly referred to as HWA, is a non-native invasive insect originating from Asia. It was first identified in the 1950s within the eastern United States, and many reports have cited the first known occurrence happening in Richmond, Virginia, and then spreading shortly afterwards from there. There are 2 main tree species this pest feeds on, the eastern hemlock and the Carolina hemlock tree. The insect will feed on the branches of the tree, causing damage, and then over time, the needles actually fall off. This damage also restricts water flow throughout the plant system, commonly leading to tree mortality. So the map on the right shows the distribution of HWA on the East Coast. And as you can see, it extends from Georgia all the way north to Maine, reflecting the native range of hemlock trees. The lower right photo is a common characteristic of hemlock trees affected by this insect, having a white woolly appearance on the branches. This is produced by the adelgid while it feeds on the tree and provides a protective insulation layer for them during the colder winter months, along with providing a home to lay their eggs in. So why would anyone even care about hemlock trees? Well, hemlock trees are regarded as a foundational vegetation species within their native range. This means they influence forest structure in the surrounding ecosystem where they are present. They provide cover and food for animals such as white-tailed deer and various bird species. Additionally, due to their dense foliage, they create constant shade and act as a temperature regulator for streams, which is vital for aquatic fauna such as trout. An example of a healthy stand of eastern hemlock trees is shown here on the left. And as you can see, it has a relatively open forest floor and is protective against weather events. However, the photo on the right is an example of a typical HWA affected forest with a dead hemlock tree lying on the forest floor, providing very few benefits to the ecosystem. So my region of interest for this project is Shenandoah National Park, which is located in Western Virginia, just west of Washington, D.C. And it's a mountainous park, approximately 200,000 acres in size. Of the 2 hemlock species mentioned earlier, this park is home to the eastern hemlock tree. HWA was discovered in the park in 1988 and led to a substantial decrease in hemlock tree stand health afterwards. Since then, a majority of the large pure stands of hemlock trees in the park have been lost to HWA, with remaining populations consisting of singular trees within the forest. Management techniques were initiated since the discovery of HWA, starting out with monitoring efforts, followed by a shift to control techniques. Control techniques for this insect consist of soil applications of a chemical to provide the hemlock trees with resistance against it. There is a biological control method as well, and it's actually a predator beetle that feeds on the HWA. However, it hasn't been fully adapted yet due to difficulty obtaining and establishing populations of the beetle. So the reason I became interested in this topic is because I actually work for the Park Service as a biological science technician at Shenandoah. And I've actually done some of the field work for hemlock trees there. Firsthand experience has shown me there is a need for a rapid assessment and identification tool for this type of work. Field work to locate hemlock trees and manage them is very resource intensive, meaning a lot of hiking is involved during surveys to find these trees, along with person hours to conduct control efforts and health assessments on them. For this project, I plan to assess whether a geographic object-based image analysis or GeoVia workflow can be utilized to identify and assess hemlock trees in a portion of Shen from remotely sensed data. I have 2 primary objectives. The first being to determine how accurately hemlock trees can be located through this type of analysis. And the second is to create a health assessment of trees over time, specifically from 2009 to 2018, using the normalized difference vegetation index. The study area I'll be focusing on to test this workflow is in the central region of the park, which includes a variety of terrain features such as mountain peaks and valleys, along with a popular vacation resort called Skyland. A mixture of hiking trails and roadways are in this area, most notably Skyline Drive. The entire area is about 6 by 3 kilometers or 6,300 acres. I selected this site due to personal knowledge of the area, having worked here for almost 10 years, along with the large amount of ground truth information available, as you can see by the blue waypoints on the map. So let's take a closer look at the data I'll need for this project within a smaller portion of the main study area I just showed you. The first source is a set of hemlock waypoints I got from Shenandoah, and those will act as ground truth information to check my results. The waypoints were collected between 2008 and 2021, and each point represents an individual live hemlock tree in the park. They were taken by Garmin GPS units with a typical accuracy of about 4 meters. Each of these trees have been treated for HWA, and for a majority of them are healthy trees and do not represent dead hemlocks. These trees have been found through ground surveys, and the purpose of taking a waypoint is for basically to help park rangers find them in the future for future management practices. The primary imagery and data source I'm using is a set of digital ortho imagery, one from 2009 and then another set from 2018. And they were taken during leaf off conditions, which is key to locating hemlock trees since they hold their needles year round and are more easily located in imagery this time of year. The spatial resolution is 0.3 meters in 8-bit format with a spectral resolution of 4 bands, including the red, green, blue, and near-infrared image bands. An example of a 2009 tile is shown here on the right, displayed in color infrared, with bright red areas representing healthy vegetation within the forest. I plan to use LiDAR data to create different elevation products as well. This includes a digital elevation model, a normalized digital surface model, and a normalized digital terrain model. The LiDAR was sourced from the Virginia Geographic Information Network and was collected in the winter of 2014 with a nominal point spacing of 0.6 meters. An example of this is shown on the right with flight lines visible in the LiDAR points collected over the park. So from that LiDAR, I'm going to make a digital elevation model, which is a raster generated from all ground classified points. It depicts the bare earth surface and is useful for examining elevation of an area of interest, along with calculating height metrics of various above ground features that I'll show you next. So the next raster I plan to make is a normalized digital surface model, which is a surface made from the first return LiDAR pulses, regardless of their classification. It'll depict height of features above the ground once normalized with the digital elevation model. And it's useful for examining forest structure and identifying features of interest. So when you look at the image on the right, brighter white represents taller features in this area, ranging from trees to building. And this becomes a little more obvious when it's classified with different colors. So in this example, green areas show features between, they're approximately from 0 to 4 meters tall, while dark red shows features between 18 and 35 meters tall. And then the last product I plan to make is a digital terrain model of the last return LiDAR pulses, regardless of classification. The digital elevation model will be subtracted from this, and it'll show lower portions of features throughout my study area with height. So in my case, a lot of the hemlock trees in the forest show up because of having low hanging canopy, which was captured from the LiDAR pulses, and many of them can be seen on the right as small speckled areas. Two main software packages will be used for my project. The first being ArcGIS Pro, which will be used for pre-processing my data, along with analyzing my results. The second package is eCognition Developer, a remote sensing software program allowing for feature extraction from a set of stacked data layers through an object-based workflow approach. A broad overview of the Geovia workflow that I'll be doing consists of 3 steps: segmentation, classification, and exportation of my results. So a more detailed view of my workflow can be seen here. Starting with ArcGIS Pro, I'll pre-process all of my data sets that I plan to use. This will include coordinate system alignments, followed by mosaicing, or essentially stitching my imagery tiles together to make one single high-resolution image to use later on. Then I'll generate elevation surfaces mentioned earlier from LiDAR point clouds. All of my rasters will be exported to an 8-bit TIFF file, clipped to my study area polygon. Next, I'll use eCognition for the analysis, starting with segmenting my imagery to create representative objects for trees. Then I'll generate a variety of information about those objects to help identify hemlock trees. This will include spectral, spatial, textural, and geometric measures. And I'll record all this down into an identification table for my chosen classes. Object classification will be done after this, using the unique characteristics from all my data sources are recorded in my identification tables, with the goal to tease out hemlock trees from everything else in the imagery. Finally, the results will be exported back into ArcGIS Pro to create map products. Statistical measures will be created as well, including an error matrix, a raster scatter plot, and a health assessment of hemlock trees over time. This entire process will be done twice, given that I'm doing it for 2 different time periods, allowing me to complete the health assessment of hemlock trees over time. This will specifically be done by comparing NDVI values from the 2009 period to the 2018 period, and then calculating changes in the index to assess the overall health of hemlocks. So let's take a look at a pilot project I did in Geography 883 to make more sense in this workflow. This is a view of what it looks like in eCognition software once I load all of my data into it. Essentially, an automated process is created called a rule set to extract information out of the data. This pilot project was actually done on the same small section I showed everyone during my data review. I just zoomed into a very small portion of it here to highlight what happens. So the first step is to segment the image using various algorithms that essentially cut up the imagery in the chunks of meaningful pixels contained in objects, or in the GIS world, polygons. As you can see, buildings and parking lots were segmented into objects containing similar pixels, while trees and grass were excluded from those and have their own objects. Since all the previously mentioned data layers were loaded in the eCognition and are stacked on top of each other, you can extract a ton of information out about these objects. So by clicking on one, an object information table is produced, and that can be seen here in the middle. And from this, it'll list all sorts of attributes about any given object. The table in the middle reflects the object highlighted in green at the top right corner of the image here, which is a hemlock tree. So when I said I was going to make an identification table for hemlocks, the information I'll be recording comes from this image object table in the middle here. In this example, you can see I have a variety of information listed in the table, ranging from spectral values of the 4 image bands to height values of the normalized digital surface model underneath the image. An example of an identification table for 5 different objects representing hemlock trees is shown at the bottom. Different features will have different values for each trait, like a hemlock tree compared to a leaf-off tree within the forest. My goal is to find what makes a hemlock different from everything else in my study area. So the next step is to use these characteristics from the identification table and enter them into an assigned class algorithm. Once run, the classified objects are given a color. So here, the hemlock trees are in green, and were chosen by the algorithm based off height and a textural measure of the near infrared band. And by continuing this process for the remaining unclassified objects, I can identify other vegetation, and then I can identify non-vegetated areas. Finally, those regions can be cleaned up by merging portions together, like small objects within larger ones. So taking a full-scale look at this process, here's the entire pilot project image prior to running the rule set. And once run, the resulting classification looks like this. Dark green areas are classified hemlock trees in this map. And while it does not look like the prettiest picture, my goal in this pilot project was to nail down the basic workflow and data processing needed. I plan to refine my results in this capstone project by spending extra time for each of these steps in my methodology. Another way to view the results is to turn those classified tree objects into waypoints. And one of the major advantages of this workflow is that if I'm able to accurately classify hemlock trees in the forest, this automated process could be used to locate trees for the entire park from remotely sensed data and save time for field crews who have traditionally been doing ground surveys to locate them. To assess the results of my pilot project, I was able to create an image scatter plot to provide a general overview of how well the classified objects compared to the ground truth data that was supplied from Shenandoah. To do this, I converted the ground truth waypoints from a vector to a raster, and then made a composite image between those and the classified results I produced in eCognition. ArcGIS Pro has a tool to make an image scatter plot when data is formatted in this way, and the results look like the plot on the right here. This provides a general overview of how well the classified objects compare to the ground truth waypoints, with about 42% of the areas I extracted matching up to the ground truth data. Reasons for these low results likely stems from class confusion. And you could see this in the example that I showed you guys, specifically where some objects held more than one feature, like where a tree and a car were within a single object. To correct for this in my capstone, I plan to spend more time creating identification keys and testing variations of my rule set, especially during segmentation to capture single features per object. I feel as though I'll be able to identify hemlock trees accurately if I can find enough unique characteristics out about them. So the timeline I plan to follow is to use December and January to do my data pre-processing, rule set development, and the Geobia analysis. February to March, I plan on doing my accuracy assessment, create final map products, and begin writing my results. And then April to May, my plan is to generate a final written report, create a story map if time permits, and then present at Penn State's virtual Zoom conference. I anticipate my results to show that a Geobia workflow can adequately identify hemlock trees within my study area. The overall health of classified hemlocks is expected to stay constant or increase slightly due to management efforts for HWA in this area. Final map products will include waypoints and polygons of classified hemlock trees with attributes of interest like tree width. And that's everything I had for today. So thank you for your time, guys. Are there any questions?
Great job, John. Any questions? You just, I had a question that you just answered on the anticipated results slide, that it sounds like this project is more to identify trees, not to identify trees to be treated because you have that map of the treated trees, but to assess the health. And then once that, would more treatment be necessary, or how, if you decided that the tree health wasn't optimal, or how would that work?
So yeah, the goal is, so all the trees in the study area have been treated either once or twice within the time period I'm looking at. And generally the park, treats trees on a reoccurring basis, say every, I don't know, I think it's between 8 to 10 years, they'll treat them again. But, if my results show that the trees are staying healthier longer, they could potentially use this information and, treat them a little bit further apart from each other. So like, instead of treating them every 8 years, they could treat them every 15 years or 20 years if the health is staying consistent when comparing them through the imagery. So.
Got it. Thank you. It looks like Lauren has a question.
Have you looked at any of Jarlath O'Neill Dunn's research on tree canopy using eCognition? I did a similar project last year and found the literature to be really helpful for coming up with a method for delineating individual tree canopies and representing them as vector data. So yeah, honestly, I found a ton of literature from O'Neill Dunn, and especially like with the LiDAR portions for extracting tree canopy, I've found that like tremendously useful as far as figuring out what surfaces to make, like the digital terrain model and the surface model as well. So yeah, he's been super helpful, and I plan to continue looking up information that he has to help with this project.
Great. Any other questions? I was also curious if are they planting any new hemlocks in the area?
No, not that I know of. I think one of the reasons they're not is just because it's a very like slow growing tree. And I honestly, I don't know if I can't think of too many places, if any, that actually have hemlock tree saplings for sale. So right now their current management plan is just to kind of preserve what the remaining healthy trees are left in the park. But that is a good point. I mean, would be worth looking into nurseries on the east if they sell hemlock trees that include in the park.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like there aren't any other questions at the moment. Adrian had the same question as me. I think about that a lot because we have some hemlocks on our property, and it's sad to think if, we can't treat them all like the park can. So, just always trying to think of what will it look like in the future if they're gone. So
No, I know it's a huge concern. I mean, I even up north and I'm originally from New York. My family has property up there, and like
okay,
half of the woods that we own are hemlock trees, and
yeah,
they haven't been affected by HWA there. But I think one of the reasons is that the adelgid is actually limited by cold temperatures. So the further
Okay.
north you get, the trees are less affected that way. But
yeah. I that picture on the right that you had that at the beginning, the areas that are affected, I recognize that. We definitely have some of that.
mm-hmm.
Well, good job. We like I said, yeah, put your email address there in the chat and you might get some more questions.
All right, can do. Thank you.
Yep, thanks. And we will move on. Lauren Russell is next and the final presenter of the day. So Lauren, whenever you're ready.
Okay, can everybody hear me and see my slides, first of all?
Yes, we can.
Okay, one sec here. Okay, so good morning, everybody, or I guess it's probably good afternoon for a lot of you in Pennsylvania. I'm in Colorado, so it's still morning here. But my name is Lauren Russell, and my capstone advisor is Jesse Cry. And what I'm going to be working on for my capstone project proposal is going to be looking at leveraging consumer drones for wildland fire monitoring using a technique called motion imagery. And that's going to allow me to generate some feature data extracted directly from the imagery itself, which I'm then going to hope to be able to validate the positional and thematic accuracy of. And that's kind of going to be the main thrust of the project. So this is a video. Hopefully everybody's got good internet connectivity, but this is a video showing UAS collected electro-optical video data of a fire in Arizona. And for me, I come from a fire background. I fought fire on the ground for a number of years, and then I was a helicopter crew member, and then I got pulled into doing data processing for small UAS, both fixed wing and rotary wing. And so for me, looking at this stuff's really, really exciting, not just for the dramatic effect of the video itself, which is pretty cool, but also from just the value added that this kind of data can provide to a decision maker. Because, only a couple years ago, this required somebody who needed to get a lay of the land, see what the fire was doing, getting on a helicopter, flying around and checking out what they were looking at. And the problem was they had no way of actually taking what they saw and being able to communicate it accurately to anybody else other than just drawing arrows on a map. So that's really what the thrust of my project is looking at is how do we take this video, which is inherent anytime you fly a UAS because the pilot isn't on board the aircraft and he or she has to utilize video in order to understand where they are in space and maintain situational awareness as they prosecute their mission. So how do we take that and how do we actually project it to a map and then hopefully be able to run some feature extraction workflows on it in order to actually pull features of interest out of that video data that are important to us. And so an overview, what I'm going to talk about in order to flesh that out is just a little bit of background. I'll talk about my problem statement, the methodology that I'll be using in order to approach the project, and then my research plan. And the key takeaway here, like I said, I come from fire, and I can tell you that small UAS are already out there. They're in the field, and they're in the backs of engines and hotshot buggies and pickup trucks, and they're being flown on a nightly basis, collecting massive volumes of data. Again, just by nature of the fact that you have to collect in order to maintain situational awareness while you actually fly the thing. And this here really kind of illustrates that. This is sort of a day in the life of a UAS pilot. This was on a fire last year outside Susanville, California, called the Beckworth Complex. And this particular gentleman, as you can see, he spent most of his night shift working on a relatively large chunk of ground. This is a couple of square miles, but he flew just a massive amount. And in the process of flying all these flight lines that you see here, he was panning his camera around and collecting like probably 10 times more data than these flight lines actually indicate. But the problem is that the current state of the art that's used in fireline small UAS operations is really the only positional data that's accessible to pilots or data specialists in the field who are trying to make sense of this collection is aircraft position data. And that image on the right there, I think, really illustrates why this is a major limitation, because in this particular shot here, you can see we have a GPS coordinate for the location of the aircraft. But most of the white hot fire located off in the distance in that image isn't actually usable because we don't have any positional information to help us understand where it's located and how far away from us it's located. And sometimes folks will try to look at images like this and sort of do their own sort of amateur imagery interpretation on it. I've fallen into that trap before myself, and I can say that it's very difficult to pull off to any degree of accuracy because there's so much distortion that comes with these types of low oblique perspective views that you run into just a whole bunch of pitfalls trying to manually plot this stuff on the map. So they've come up with some pretty interesting and ingenious ways of working around that. And one of the major ways that UAS pilots go about actually collecting linear feature data in order to capture the fire's edge is they'll actually position the aircraft above the fire, and then they'll fly along with the camera looking straight down at nadir and basically trace the fire's edge. But that's a pretty time-intensive process. And as you can see, kind of looking at that, this shows one of those last frames on the video on that previous slide. He tilted the camera up from that nadir position. And so that brought into his field of regard data that the aircraft was not actually positioned over. And so even though the video frame in question here was captured when the aircraft was located at that far northwest extent of the track shown on the map on the right, the reality is that the sensor is capturing data at that oblique perspective, which means that the principal point of the image, or the image center point, is actually located to the north of the aircraft's position, which is closer to this location. And That's not that big of a problem for, you know, this type of situation where he hasn't really pitched the sensor up very much, but you can imagine that as you continue to pitch up and up and up and get a higher and higher, or I should say a lower and lower degrees of pitch on your sensor, you're going to continue to see that principal point move further and further away from the aircraft. And then you're also going to see an increasing amount of distortion at the far edge of the image. But he did a pretty good job, as you can see. I mean, he was able to capture data for, this is actually about 1.5 miles worth of line. And you can see it lines up pretty well there to data that was collected about 6 hours previously by a manned aircraft that has a pretty capable thermal infrared imaging system. But we can start kind of poking holes in this, right? Because what if the video, in the process of the pilot panning around and checking out what was going on around him in order to orient himself to where he was, because remember, he's using the video not only to collect, but also to fly. What if the video had captured a spot fire that was out ahead of the main fire, like located maybe here, maybe 1/4 mile off to the west? Well, the problem there is that we don't have any means of extracting the location of that piece of fire using the data provided by the aircraft position alone, unless the pilot were to abort his previously planned mission of mapping the main fire's edge and go hunting spot fires, which burns up batteries fast. And so you can see how the inefficiencies start to cascade here, because we're really not able to utilize a vast proportion of the data that we're collecting. So how do we solve that? And how do we crack the nut of being able to harvest all that meaningful data that's captured in the video without having to rely on the aircraft position alone? And the answer to that is using a process called motion imagery, which is also referred to sometimes as full motion video. And this is a technique that was developed by the Defense Department in order to basically direct georeference video frames coming off of unmanned aerial vehicles. And what it basically does is that it uses sensor and aircraft telemetry metadata in order to conduct a bunch of math in order to determine what the center point of the image is projected from image space to map space. And you can see that over there on the right as that video plays. And then from there, you're able to do some more math in order to identify the 4 corners of the image frame in the map space itself. And so that really increases the contextual interpretability of our video frames, because now we're able to know, generally speaking, where on the earth we're looking in any particular frame. So we know that there's data coming off of these small UAS, consumer grade UAS, that are being flown. I've worked with it extensively, and there's stuff that meets MSB spec 0601 to actually create motion imagery. Obviously, it's limited by its quality, but basically, we know we have the data, we know we have the process, and so the question is, how do we go about making it happen? And the fact of the matter is that there's no standardized process existing currently for generating motion imagery from Fireline small UAS data, but everybody that you talk to in this line of work will tell you that there's a massive demand for it and a massive need, and it can really help not only help fire managers more effectively suppress wildfires, but it can also contribute to keeping firefighters safe on the line. So this project proposes a process to do that, and it seeks to execute that process on sample data in order to investigate a couple questions. Number one, can we generate that motion imagery data that meets acceptable standards of positional accuracy? So are we confident that where we're placing something on the map is actually where that feature actually existed in real life? And then is it possible to extract meaningful feature data from the video depicting the presence of fire that meets acceptable standards of thematic accuracy? And so I've got a 3-phase workflow put together in order to pursue that problem statement. phase one is to develop the workflow. And so, like I said, I've been working in fire UAS for a number of years now, and doing this this kind of motion imagery work has kind of been a passion project of mine for about 2 years. So I've had the good fortune of getting tied in with some folks that are a whole heck of a lot smarter than me when it comes to doing the math and the programming that's involved in actually accomplishing this workflow. And so I'm happy to say that it's pretty much at the point where it's developed and it's working. And what it basically does is, we're projecting frames back and forth from image space to map space. We're visualizing that data as full motion video. Got a user interface to tinker with it. We're doing terrain correction to account for, variations in topography, doing the feature extraction, and we're generating outputs, which we can then put on a map. This is basically the model, and this is a very simplified model of a very complicated process. Like I said, there's some 10-pound brains that are helping me work on it, but basically what we're doing, 3 outputs coming off of the aircraft after you fly the mission, right? Video, aircraft telemetry, and sensor telemetry. We can throw all that into our black box that we built in Python and generate motion imagery. That's a very simplistic representation. It's 2-dimensional planar view, but it assumes flat terrain. Obviously, that's not the case, especially in the kind of places where wildfires are burning. So we have to apply a DEM in order to make a terrain correction. We have a pretty complicated process, which I think is kind of novel for coming up with that. And if anybody wants to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to kind of go into the details of that, but we don't really have time for it today. The output of that's 8-bit georeference video. And that's really, I think, an accomplishment in and of itself, because as I said before, we're able to give that decision maker really a heightened state of contextual interpretability for that imagery that just increases its value and its actionability, I think, by orders of magnitude. But we can really increase the sort of the circle of influence around, that piece of reporting by extracting features from that video and then actually putting them on the map as GIS data, because then it can be shared by different players and everybody can get on the same sheet of music as they make decisions that inevitably affect each other. We do that by using some computer vision techniques in order to basically analyze the histogram, pull pixels of interest that we assess to be hot out of that image frame, and then that allows us to conduct ray tracing using the sensor model on only those pixels of interest. And so that saves us having to ortho rectify each image frame, which at 30 Hertz is going to take days. And it really saves us a lot of computing power. From there, what we do is we gather up all of those pixels of interest that we observed, and we basically use them to populate a lower resolution grid cell array, which is basically a US National Grid 10-meter grid square array. And from there, we're able to output some raster data, which we can then turn around and use. I'm not trying to say that this process model I got up here really, describes in great detail what it is we're doing. I have another one that is it's got so much spaghetti going on that you really wouldn't be able to see it on the PowerPoint slide. But the key takeaway here is that the output of the process is a set of 10-meter raster arrays that corresponds to the US National Grid reference system. And this video shows the user interface for that program that we developed playing. And so as you can see there, what we're doing is we're taking the video on the left, which is an image space perspective view, right? And we're using the aircraft and sensor telemetry metadata combined with elevation data in order to georeference those video frames by projecting them to 2D map space. And then we run the automated feature extraction workflow, and it generates some outputs that look like this. And it's been shown here with some ancillary data just for context, but what we're looking at here is that flight track in blue for the UAS itself. And you probably recognize that from one of the previous slides. That's where the pilot was actually tracing the fire's edge. what we did is we started the feature extraction workflow at about 300 seconds into the video, and we ended it at 500 seconds. And the output was 2 raster files. The first raster file is the purple one, and it's basically the extent of the imaged grid cells. And what that means is that using our sensor footprint that we're able to generate by projecting from image space to map space, what this is telling us is every single one of those US National Grid 10-meter grid squares that was actually visible in the imagery. And it might have been visible once, or it might have been visible 1,000 times. We do keep track of that. It's important for some downstream confidence estimate stuff that is a little more detailed to get into here. But for the purposes of this presentation, this is just showing basically where the sensor looked. And then that kind of sets up the stage for probably the meat of it, which is these pink grid cells. And those are grid cells that are assessed to be heat. And again, we got that by keeping track of our pixels of interest that we identified as heat anomalies in the histogram of the 8-bit video. And we basically were incrementing our grid squares in order to keep track of which grid squares had pixels of interest occurring within them. And from there, we can take that data, and a GIS analyst or a data specialist or even a UAS pilot who's got a little bit of ArcGIS chops can plug that data in and can run some processing on it in order to generate map products like this one, which could be airdropped off to a decision maker for them to use on their phone, or even a KML file of the pink intense heat polygons, which could be easily emailed or texted around and loaded up on other folks' ops maps. So as you can see, we've got the workflow working, which is that's really was the big challenge for this, and it's working pretty well. So phase 2 is to execute the workflow on some sample data and generate outputs. And basically what we're looking to do is basically just run the workflow on some data sets that are going to set us up for success in terms of being able to conduct the positional and thematic accuracy assessments. So that begs the question of, from motion video standpoint, what makes a good sample data set for positional accuracy assessment? And I've kind of had to do quite a bit of thinking on this. I've got the Congleton and Green book and everything, and I've gone through looking at positional accuracy assessment, but there's not a lot of it about, not a lot of literature out there about how to do it on oblique motion imagery. And so what I came up with was we basically need the presence of permanent or semi-permanent photo identifiable features, and it should really be daytime electro-optical video that was collected in a built-up area so that we have those discernible features which we can find in reference imagery. And then for thematic accuracy assessment, it's a little bit different because we really do have to use data that was collected on a fire. Because obviously the presence or absence of fire in the grid square data is what we're trying to validate the accuracy of. So what's going to work really well for this is having both daytime electro-optical and thermal infrared video data sets, and these platforms collect both typically. Early morning hours are best because it's going to allow the analyst conducting the accuracy assessment to actually be able to identify features in the EO video. But what we really want is a discernible flame front that lets us really see that stark transition between burnt fuel and unburnt fuel. So once we have good data sets identified and processed, and we have data that we can then conduct our accuracy assessments on, phase 3 is to actually conduct the accuracy assessments themselves. So positional accuracy is, I should be able to take care of that myself, but the thematic accuracy piece, I'm gonna have to farm that out to volunteers. I've got some folks identified who are interested, who are all sort of come from this background, and they're used to looking at thermal infrared imagery of fire. They should take care of that for me and then push the data back to me so that I can calculate the statistics and the error matrices in order to generate the producers and users and overall accuracy. And so how do we actually perform positional accuracy on motion imagery? So again, this is like a good question. I don't really know the answer to it. So if anybody has any insight into this or thinks I'm off base, please feel free to hit me up and let me know. But basically what I'm looking to do is to plot photo identifiable checkpoints in successive frames of motion imagery, and then basically take that output of points, right? Over the course of like, 60 or 90 frames worth of video, and then calculate that national map accuracy standard CE90 statistics associated with that set of points, and then calculate the RMSE and all that good stuff from that. Performing thematic accuracy assessment on motion imagery is not quite as straightforward because there's no way to use reference data for it, because obviously we're trying to look at something that's fleeting. The presence of fire or absence of fire is not going to be easily discerned in high resolution, high accuracy reference imagery, because it was probably collected at a time when that chunk of ground wasn't on fire. So what we have to do is we have to use the actual imagery, the source imagery itself, sort of as reference imagery. And so the idea there is to back project a stratified random sample of heat and non-heat grid squares from the process data set from the map space back to the image space. So that'll allow us to actually look at that grid square in a perspective view overlaid on top of the imagery that it was captured in. We use OpenCV to basically burn that vector data into the image frames themselves. And then I'll basically just edit all those video clips together and then disseminate that composite video to the accuracy assessors for their visual interpretation. And since we're using US National Grid, we've got unique identifiers for each of these grid squares. And that's nice because we can just bust them all out in a spreadsheet. Basically, the accuracy assessor can watch the video and they can just annotate as they come to a particular grid square, whether they're assessing that there was fire observable in the EO and IR imagery inside of that grid square, or if the opposite was the case. So this is my research plan, and we talked about the 3 phases, which is kind of the wave top level strategic piece of that. I've broken that all down into tasks. So as you can see, phase 1, we're looking really, really good in terms of being complete. Green shows tasks that are complete. Yellow shows in process, and red shows haven't started yet. So just a couple of programming pieces that still need to get ironed out for phase 1. Stepping into phase 2, the big piece there is actually identifying the test imagery and metadata sets, and then coordinating permission with the data owners. And luckily, just in the last couple of days, I did get permission from National Interagency Fire Center. Their external affairs folks gave me permission to utilize data that was collected on wildfire incidents. So that kind of really is a big deal and opens up the door to be able to pursue this research further. And as you can see, we just move from there into actually running the process on each data set, and then conducting the accuracy assessment, as I talked about previously. This is the timeline for that. And as you can see for phase 1, we're kind of coming up on the end of it. It's been kind of ongoing for about a year now in terms of actually building out the code to make this work. And it basically ends pretty much at the end of the year here. Beginning of next year, phase 2 is going to kick off. It's gonna run basically until the start of spring semester 2, and then spring semester 2, which is my 596B semester, is basically going to utilize that entire span of time in order to actually conduct the positional and thematic accuracy assessments. So in summary, we talked a little bit about the background here, why this is an important project, talked about the problem statement, stepped through the methodology at a pretty high level, and also talked about the research plan. So I'll just open up to questions now, and then here's my email. I'll drop it in the chat too if anybody has more feedback or has other questions about how exactly all this stuff's going to work. So thanks a lot for your time, and I appreciate it.
Good job, Lauren. Any questions? I'll ask one while we're waiting for them to come in. When you mentioned getting data like from the National Interagency Fire, National, I don't know, whatever you called that, National Interagency Fire something.
Yeah.
Are those groups interested in what you're doing, and will you share this afterwards? And just kind of curious about how, yeah, who would?
Yeah, I work in fire. I was a Fed before, and I've moved over to the private sector now, kind of doing work with UAS and data processing. And there is a lot of interest in these types of workflows. So I think that's why the project's exciting, because it's basically working on a problem that, you know, they haven't necessarily had the bandwidth to try to solve, which is how do you actually take all this data that's being collected and actually turn it into a map product that you can be confident in the accuracy of. And so, yeah, I guess the short answer is yes. There's definitely interest amongst folks like that about taking this and running with it.
Great. Yeah, I could tell how enthusiastic you are. And the word luxury is kind of funny, but I was thinking you have the luxury of doing a master's degree to set aside some time to tackle this problem for them.
Yeah.
So that's pretty neat. And so will you just hand it over, or how do you imagine sharing it?
I don't know. I mean, at this point, it's like the point of this project is really to be able to validate whether the workflow is working the way we think it is. And so I think it's probably premature to think about how to hand it over to them, because that's probably going to depend a lot on how successful we are in accurately mapping where heat is. But I think as those results start to come in, it'll probably start to, the approach for sharing that information will definitely start to come into better regard. So
Great.
probably not a great answer, but
no, that's a good answer. Roberto has a question.
So Roberto says, could you use controlled burns for collecting this kind of data, or does it not create a discernible burn line between the burned fuel and the unburned fuel? So actually, prescribed burns, to be honest, would actually be ideal. And again, that kind of dovetails into what I was saying on the previous question about how to approach potential customers, so to speak, with this workflow, because for research purposes, prescribed burns are awesome because it actually potentially allows us to collect reference data that is telling us where a particular pixel of interest is generally located. And that's because when we ignite prescribed burns, we've got folks out there on the ground with torches full of fuel that are just dragging them and basically lighting off a strip of fire. And so we can detect that in the thermal IR imagery. And if those folks that are dragging the torches are carrying GPS data logging devices, then we can line up, you know, the timestamp of the video frame with the timestamp of where they were located in their GPS track, and then we can try to figure out, you know, calculate the residual in terms of how far off our location of our pixel of interest was. So I guess the short answer is yes, that would be great, but the long answer is getting on prescribed burns can be a process. And since there's all this data out there from wildfires available and we have the permission to use it, that's probably going to be the sort of the first go-to for executing the project. Thanks,
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it is pretty exciting work. Well, great job. Great job to everybody. We'll share the link to the evaluation one more time. I know all of the students in the class have this, but in case anybody else in the audience wants to give these students feedback, that would be great. And our next session is, let's see here. It is Monday at 6:30 p.m. So it's in the evening. So if everybody can come then, we would really appreciate it. And have a great weekend, everybody. Good job.